Mountain families in North Carolina experimented with pine needles and cattail down as moss substitutes, while Kentucky builders incorporated locally available clay types into the lime mortar mixture. The fundamental concept remained constant, creating thermal barriers through organic insulation layers sealed with flexible exterior mortars, but implementation varied according to available resources and specific climate requirements. Jacob Whitfield passed away in 1923 at the age of 78, his cabin still standing with much of its original chinking intact after 31 years of mountain weather. His great-grandson inherited the property and continued living there, maintaining the double chinking system and adding modern improvements while preserving the basic thermal envelope that had proven superior to conventional construction. The cabin became a demonstration site for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, educating visitors about innovative building techniques that had saved lives and influenced regional construction practices for generations. The legacy extended beyond mere technical innovation to encompass a broader lesson about the value of questioning established methods and adapting traditional knowledge to new circumstances, proving that preparation for extreme conditions represented wisdom rather than waste. Cove Creek Valley, Tennessee, 1892. While Jacob Whitfield's neighbors were able to quickly fill the gaps in their log cabins with the traditional clay and straw mixture in just one afternoon, Jacob, an English stonemason, meticulously used his two-layer system. First, he carefully packed sphagnum moss, mixed with deer hair, tightly against the logs. Then, he sealed the exterior with a precisely mixed clay and lime mortar. This process took him 4 full days. His neighbor scoffed, calling it stonemason foolishness and labeling him as wasteful. The typical Appalachian chinking involved local red clay mixed with chopped straw, a quick, cheap, and reasonably effective method. It took 3 men only half a day to complete a standard cabin. Whitfield's elaborate method required 32 hours of labor, a stark contrast to the 8 hours needed for the proven techniques. Then came December. The winter of 1892 to 1893 brought temperatures plummeting to 15 degrees below the seasonal average. By January, the sustained cold reached a bone-chilling 12 below zero. Standard cabins struggled to maintain a livable environment. Interior temperatures hovered around a frigid 38 degrees, even with fires burning constantly. Families burned through a staggering 5 cords of firewood by February, and ice formed on the interior walls near the chinking gaps. In stark contrast, Whitfield's cabin maintained a comfortable temperature of 58 to 62 degrees with just twice daily fires. He burned only 1.5 cords of wood through January and February combined. What knowledge did this English immigrant possess about heat, insulation, and wood movement that had eluded 3 generations of Tennessee mountain builders? If you appreciate stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, be sure to subscribe. We have more documented accounts worth remembering. The crisp morning air carried the sharp scent of early autumn as Jacob Whitfield knelt beside his 16 by 20-foot chestnut cabin, deliberately pressing handfuls of sphagnum moss between the logs. In Cove Creek Valley, September meant racing against the impending arrival of winter, and every other settler in the hollow had already finished their chinking weeks ago. Down the creek, Tom Braswell watched from his own completed cabin, shaking his head at the Englishman's peculiar methods. Whitfield had spent 3 days gathering the moss from the north-facing banks of Cove Creek, carefully selecting only the longest, most pliable strands that grew in perpetual shade, where the water ran cold and clear. Most settlers would have dismissed such meticulous selection as unnecessary fussing. However, Whitfield understood something his neighbors didn't. The cellular structure of properly harvested sphagnum moss contained countless tiny air pockets that would trap warm air more effectively than any other natural material available in those mountains. Next came the deer hair, painstakingly collected from autumn sheds found along game trails and mixed into the moss with the precision of a man who had learned his trade under demanding masters. Whitfield's father, Samuel, had taught him that medieval English builders used similar techniques, employing sheep's wool and horsehair pressed between oak timbers. But American chestnut behaved differently than European oak. These Tennessee logs would shrink and expand dramatically with temperature changes, creating gaps that rigid chinking could never accommodate. Working alone, Whitfield packed the moss and hair mixture tightly against each log, using a wooden paddle to compress the material until it formed a dense barrier between the timbers. The work progressed slowly, perhaps only 10 feet of wall per day, while his neighbors had chinked entire cabins in single afternoons, using the time-honored mountain method of red clay mixed with chopped straw. Tom Braswell eventually wandered over on the second day, curiosity overcoming his skepticism. "That's twice the work for the same result, Jake," he said, watching Whitfield carefully position another section of moss. "Clay's kept us warm for 50 years up here. Don't need fancy stonework notions." Whitfield paused in his work, wiping moss fragments from his hands. Clay works well enough," he replied, his Yorkshire accent still marking him as an outsider after 7 years in the valley. "But watch what happens come January, when these chestnut logs shrink with the cold. Your clay will crack straight through. This moss moves with the wood." Braswell snorted derisively. "These mountains have been teaching men how to build since before your grandfather was born. We know what works." He gestured toward Whitfield's elaborate preparation. "You're spending a week on work that takes half a day. Time's money up here, especially with winter coming." By the third day, other neighbors had begun stopping by to observe the strange spectacle of an immigrant taking 4 times longer than necessary to complete basic cabin maintenance. Ezra McClure, the valley's most experienced builder, arrived with obvious disapproval etched across his weathered face. McClure had chinked over 40 cabins using standard methods, and his track record spoke for itself. Families stayed warm, cabins lasted for decades, and the work got done efficiently. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," McClure told Whitfield bluntly. "Red clay, chopped straw, mix it thick, slap it on, smooth it down, done. I can chink your whole cabin in 3 hours with 2 helpers." Whitfield continued his methodical work, pressing moss into the gap between 2 large chestnut logs. "How long does your clay chinking last before it needs repair?" he asked. 3, maybe 4 years if the winter's not too harsh," McClure admitted. "But that's normal maintenance, part of mountain living." "This moss will last 8 to 10 years, Whitfield replied. "And it'll keep the cabin warmer while it does it." McClure shook his head. "You're overthinking simple work, Jake. Mountain folk have been staying warm just fine without all this fuss." The fourth day brought the second layer, Whitfield's carefully mixed clay-lime mortar that would seal the moss barrier against wind and moisture. He had spent 2 days preparing the lime, burning limestone chips in a small kiln he had built behind his cabin, then slaking the resulting quicklime with precise amounts of water. The process required knowledge of chemical reactions that most frontier builders never encountered, but Whitfield's masonry background had taught him the value of lime in creating flexible, self-sealing mortars. The final mixture contained 40% local red clay, 30% of his carefully prepared lime, 20% coarse sand from the creek bed, and 10% finely chopped chestnut bark. This outer layer would provide weather protection while allowing the inner moss barrier to function as the primary insulation. The lime would keep the mortar flexible as temperatures changed, preventing the cracking that plagued standard clay chinking. As word of Whitfield's elaborate methods spread through the valley, the comments became more pointed. "Stonemason foolishness," Tom Braswell said to his wife, loud enough for Whitfield to hear. "Making a simple job into some kind of church-building project." Even neighbors who respected Whitfield's craftsmanship questioned the expense and effort. The materials alone cost $3.50 compared to $1.80 for standard clay chinking, a significant difference for families living on tight budgets. The labor requirement told an even starker story: 32 hours of careful work versus 8 hours using proven methods. Sarah Wilson, whose family had built their cabin using McClure's standard techniques, watched Whitfield apply the final smoothing passes to his outer mortar layer. "It surely looks professional," she said diplomatically. "But I wonder if all that extra work will make much difference come winter." October arrived, catching some families still making final preparations for the cold months ahead. Standard cabins throughout the valley required their first fires of the season as temperatures dropped into the 30s. Whitfield's cabin remained comfortable without any heating, the dense moss barrier and flexible lime mortar maintaining interior warmth through the night. Tom Braswell noticed the absence of smoke from Whitfield's chimney during the early morning hours when his own fire had died to coals, but he dismissed it as coincidence. Real winter had not yet arrived. The true test would come with December's killing cold, when every gap in a cabin's defenses would mean the difference between comfort and misery, between warmth and death. November brought the familiar rhythm of winter preparation to Cove Creek Valley as families throughout the hollow began the annual race against the cold. Tom Braswell and his sons spent long days splitting oak and hickory, building the customary 6 to 8 cord woodpile that would see them through until spring. Down the creek, Ezra McClure banked dirt around his cabin's foundation and checked his roof for loose chinking between the split log shingles. Sarah Wilson's husband repaired a section of clay chinking that had developed hairline cracks during the autumn's freeze-thaw cycles, mixing fresh red clay with chopped straw according to the time-tested formula his father had taught him. Jacob Whitfield's preparations drew curious stares and whispered comments. While his neighbors built towering wood piles, the Englishman cut only 4 cords of seasoned chestnut and oak, barely half the amount that mountain wisdom deemed necessary for a harsh winter. Tom Braswell, red-faced and sweating, hauling another armload of split hickory past Whitfield's modest pile, shook his head in disbelief. "That man's going to freeze his family come January," he told his wife that evening. 4 cords won't last past February, and that's if we get a mild winter." The mathematics of mountain survival were unforgiving and well understood by every family in the valley. A standard 16 by 20-foot cabin required constant heating from December through March to maintain livable temperatures. Experience had taught the settlers that each cord of hardwood would burn for approximately 3 weeks during steady use, meaning 6 cords provided the bare minimum for winter survival, with 8 cords offering comfortable security against unexpected cold snaps or late springs. Whitfield's confidence in his reduced firewood supply puzzled even his more supportive neighbors. Sarah Wilson, who had watched his elaborate chinking process with respectful interest, mentioned her concerns to her husband. "Perhaps he knows something about efficient burning that we don't," she suggested, though doubt colored her voice. He did seem mighty particular about every detail of that cabin work. The technical differences between standard mountain chinking and Whitfield's double-layer system were becoming apparent as temperatures dropped. McClure's proven method involved mixing 60% local red clay with 30% chopped straw and 10% water, creating a mortar that dried to a hard, wind-resistant surface. Applied in a single 2-inch layer directly between the logs, this chinking could be completed quickly and economically, requiring minimal specialized knowledge or expensive materials. Whitfield's approach represented a fundamental departure from frontier pragmatism. His inner layer of compressed sphagnum moss mixed with deer hair created what modern building science would recognize as an R3 insulation value per inch, nearly 3 times the thermal resistance of solid clay. The outer clay-lime mixture, with its carefully balanced proportions of 40% clay, 30% lime, 20% sand, and 10% chopped chestnut bark, formed a flexible barrier that would bend with wood movement rather than crack under stress. The first hard freeze arrived during the 3rd week of November, dropping nighttime temperatures to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Standard cabins throughout the valley required fires by 4 o'clock in the afternoon to maintain comfortable interior temperatures, with families banking coals carefully to preserve heat through the night. Whitfield's cabin remained warm until 7 o'clock without any heating, the dense moss barrier trapping enough residual heat from the day's sun to extend comfortable conditions well into the evening. McClure, walking past Whitfield's cabin on his way to check his own firewood supply, noticed the absence of chimney smoke during the early evening hours when every other cabin in the valley showed steady columns of gray rising into the still air. The observation troubled him more than he cared to admit. His own cabin, chinked according to methods passed down through 3 generations of mountain builders, required careful fire management to prevent the interior temperature from dropping below 40 degrees during cold nights. Temperature measurements, though crude by modern standards, told a revealing story during those early tests of both chinking systems. Using simple mercury thermometers placed against interior walls, the differences became quantifiable. Outside temperatures of 32 degrees Fahrenheit translated to 45 degrees inside standard cabins without active fires, while Whitfield's cabin maintained 52 degrees under identical conditions. The 7-degree difference represented more than mere comfort. It meant the difference between water freezing in wash basins and remaining liquid, between children needing heavy blankets and sleeping soundly in light coverings. Community gossip began focusing on Whitfield's unconventional preparations with increasing intensity. His English background, combined with his departure from accepted building practices, marked him as an outsider whose methods challenged established mountain wisdom. Tom Braswell's criticism grew sharper as November progressed. "Man thinks he knows better than folks who've been surviving these winters since before the Revolution," he told Ezra McClure during a chance meeting at the creek. "All that fancy work and half the firewood he needs. Pride comes before a fall, especially up here in the mountains." McClure found himself caught between professional skepticism and growing curiosity about Whitfield's results. As the valley's most experienced builder, he had staked his reputation on proven methods that had successfully sheltered dozens of families through harsh mountain winters. Yet, the evidence of his own senses suggested that Whitfield's elaborate techniques were producing measurably superior results. The Englishman's cabin stayed warmer longer, required less firewood for basic heating, and showed no signs of the minor air leaks that plagued even well-built standard construction. The social dynamics of the isolated mountain community intensified the pressure on both sides. Whitfield's success would vindicate unconventional methods and suggest that generations of mountain builders had been settling for inferior results. Failure, however, would confirm the community's wisdom and mark the immigrants' techniques as dangerous experimentation that could cost lives during the brutal months ahead. December's arrival brought the first real snow to Cove Creek Valley, 3 inches of powder that transformed the landscape and served notice that winter's serious business had begun. Standard cabins required steady fires to combat the increased heat loss that came with sustained below-freezing temperatures. Whitfield's cabin continued to outperform community expectations, maintaining comfortable interior conditions with minimal fuel consumption, while his neighbors fed hungry fireplaces throughout lengthening nights. December brought temperatures that old-timers remembered as 15 degrees below the usual bitter cold that marked Tennessee mountain winters. The mercury in Tom Braswell's thermometer, nailed to the north side of his cabin where it caught no direct sunlight, rarely climbed above 20 degrees during daylight hours and plunged to 0 or below most nights. By the middle of the month, sustained cold had settled over Cove Creek Valley with the relentless persistence that marked truly dangerous winters. Snow began falling on December 18th and continued intermittently for 6 days, accumulating to depths that reached the windowsills of most cabins. The white blanket, beautiful in its pristine uniformity, trapped families indoors for days at a time and created the isolation that could turn minor problems into life-threatening emergencies. Roads became impassable, neighbors lost contact for weeks, and each family's survival depended entirely on their individual preparation and the integrity of their shelter. Tom Braswell's cabin, built according to the proven methods that had served his family for 3 generations, began showing the strain of prolonged extreme cold. Interior temperatures struggled to reach 38 degrees despite fires that burned continuously from dawn to midnight. The red clay chinking applied in late August, according to traditional techniques, developed hairline cracks as the chestnut logs contracted with the cold. These microscopic gaps allowed frigid air to seep into the cabin's interior, creating drafts that no amount of banking could eliminate. The thermal dynamics at work were invisible, but relentless. Cold air, denser than warm air, sought every available path into the heated interior, while warm air rose and escaped through gaps near the roof line. Standard clay chinking, for all its proven effectiveness in moderate winters, conducted cold directly through the cabin walls like a thermal bridge connecting interior warmth to exterior cold. The chopped straw mixed into the clay provided minimal insulation value, serving primarily as a binding agent rather than a thermal barrier. Braswell found himself rising 3 times each night to feed his fire, banking coals carefully to maintain enough heat to prevent the interior temperature from dropping below freezing. His family had taken to sleeping in the single room closest to the fireplace, abandoning the cabin's other spaces to conserve fuel and concentrate warmth. Despite these precautions, ice formed on the interior walls each morning, particularly along the north-facing wall, where gaps in the chinking allowed moisture-laden breath to condense and freeze. The firewood consumption proved more alarming than the discomfort. By Christmas Day, Braswell had burned through 3 of his 8 cords, a pace that would exhaust his winter supply by early February if the cold persisted. Each cord represented weeks of summer labor, cut and split during precious hours stolen from farming and other essential tasks. Running short of firewood in January or February meant facing a choice between dangerous expeditions into snow-covered forests or slow death by freezing. Ezra McClure's cabin, chinked with the same time-tested methods he had used successfully for decades, faced similar struggles. The veteran builder found himself questioning techniques that had never failed him before, watching his carefully applied clay chinking develop stress fractures as the logs shrank with sustained cold. His professional reputation rested on these methods, yet the evidence of his own experience suggested that standard techniques were being pushed beyond their limits by the unprecedented severity of the winter. McClure's family had consolidated into their kitchen, the cabin's warmest room, where they spent their days clustered around a fire that consumed nearly a third of a cord each week. The remaining rooms stood empty and unheated, their interior temperatures hovering just above freezing despite the continuous heating of the main living space. Ice formed nightly on the windows and interior walls of these abandoned areas, creating a crystalline testimony to the limits of traditional mountain building techniques. A quarter-mile upstream, Jacob Whitfield's cabin presented a stark contrast to his neighbor's struggles. Interior temperatures maintained a steady 58 to 62 degrees with fires built only twice daily, morning and evening, using the precise firing schedule that maximized heat output while minimizing fuel consumption. The dense sphagnum moss barrier compressed between his cabin's chestnut logs trapped warm air in thousands of tiny pockets, while the flexible lime clay outer layer sealed against wind infiltration without cracking under thermal stress. Whitfield's family continued to use their entire cabin throughout the winter, with comfortable temperatures in all rooms and no need to abandon spaces to the cold. The children played on floors that remained warm to the touch, while adults worked at indoor tasks without the heavy coats and blankets that had become standard winter clothing in neighboring cabins. No ice formed on interior walls and condensation remained minimal due to the superior vapor barrier created by the double-layer chinking system. The fuel efficiency proved even more remarkable than the comfort levels. Through December and into January, Whitfield burned wood at approximately one-third the rate of his neighbors, using seasoned chestnut and oak with the efficiency of a man whose heating system actually retained the energy produced rather than allowing it to escape through thermal bridges and air leaks. His modest 4-cord winter supply, initially viewed as dangerously inadequate, appeared sufficient to carry his family through the entire winter, with reserves remaining for emergency use. Sarah Wilson, whose family had moved into their single warmest room like most of their neighbors, noticed the steady wisps of smoke rising from Whitfield's chimney only twice each day, while her own fire burned continuously. The observation troubled her husband, who had dismissed the Englishman's elaborate preparation as unnecessary complication. Their cabin, chinked using McClure's proven methods, required constant attention to maintain barely acceptable interior temperatures, while Whitfield's family appeared to live in comfortable warmth with minimal effort. Word spread slowly through the isolated valley about the performance differences between building techniques. Neighbors who had mocked Whitfield's wasteful preparation began paying attention to the practical results visible in reduced firewood consumption and comfortable living conditions. The theoretical superiority of time-tested methods was being challenged by measurable outcomes that could mean the difference between surviving the winter and succumbing to cold that killed families every year throughout the Appalachian region. By late January, temperatures had dropped to 12 degrees below zero during several sustained cold snaps, creating conditions that pushed every cabin in Cove Creek Valley to its thermal limits. Standard chinking began failing visibly, with gaps opening between logs as the wood contracted beyond the elastic limits of rigid clay mortar. Whitfield's flexible moss and lime system continued to perform, adapting to wood movement while maintaining its insulating properties and structural integrity. March 3, 1893, arrived with a fury that caught even experienced mountain families unprepared. The late-season blizzard struck, without the gradual temperature drop that usually signaled approaching severe weather, plunging the mercury from a deceptive 28 degrees at sunset to 18 below zero by midnight. 40-mile-per-hour winds drove snow horizontally across Cove Creek Valley, creating the most dangerous combination of cold and wind pressure that anyone could remember in 30 years of mountain winters. Tom Braswell woke at 2 in the morning to find his fire reduced to barely glowing coals and his cabin's interior temperature dropping precipitously. The wind drove frigid air through every gap in his clay chinking with relentless persistence, overwhelming his fireplace's ability to heat the space faster than cold air infiltrated. Despite throwing every piece of seasoned wood within reach onto the fire, the interior temperature continued falling, reaching 28 degrees by dawn, 4 degrees below the freezing point that marked the boundary between discomfort and mortal danger. The clay chinking along Braswell's north wall had cracked completely during the night, thermal stress finally overwhelming the rigid mortar's ability to accommodate the extreme contraction of the chestnut logs. Hairline fractures had widened into visible gaps where daylight showed through the cabin wall, creating wind tunnels that funneled Arctic air directly into the family's living space. His wife gathered their 3 children into the single bed closest to the fireplace, wrapping them in every available blanket while Braswell fed the fire continuously in a desperate attempt to maintain enough heat to prevent hypothermia. Ezra McClure faced an even more critical situation in his cabin downstream. The veteran builder had always taken pride in his chinking work, but 40 years of successful construction experience could not overcome the physics of thermal bridging and air infiltration during unprecedented cold. His cabin's interior dropped to 25 degrees despite a fire that consumed wood faster than he could split and carry it from his depleted woodpile. The continuous burning had exhausted nearly 6 cords of his winter supply, leaving him dangerously short of fuel, with potentially weeks of cold weather remaining. McClure's family had abandoned all pretense of normal cabin life, retreating to a single corner room where they huddled together for shared body warmth, while he maintained a fire that barely kept the space above freezing. Ice formed on the interior walls despite the continuous heating, and frost covered every surface more than 5 feet from the flames. His professional confidence, built on decades of successful mountain construction, crumbled as he watched standard techniques fail catastrophically under conditions that, while severe, fell within the range of weather that mountain families had to survive. The Wilson family cabin presented perhaps the most frightening example of standard chinking failure under extreme conditions. Their children, aged 4, 7, and 9, began showing early symptoms of hypothermia despite being dressed in multiple layers of clothing and wrapped in wool blankets. The youngest child's lips developed a blue tinge that marked the beginning stages of cold injury, while all 3 children complained of numbness in their fingers and toes. Their father, burning the last of his seasoned firewood and beginning to split greenwood in desperation, faced the terrifying prospect of watching his family freeze inside what should have been a protective shelter. Throughout the valley, families discovered that winter survival depended on more than adequate firewood supplies and well-built fireplaces. The integrity of the thermal envelope, the cabin's ability to retain heated air while excluding cold air, determined whether a family would survive. They risked succumbing to the extreme weather or finding their shelters turned into deadly traps. The typical clay chinking, usually sufficient for normal winters, became a thermal liability, conducting the cold directly through the cabin walls and allowing air to infiltrate, rendering any amount of heating ineffective. The wind played a critical role in exacerbating the situation, creating pressure differences that forced frigid air through every imperfection in the chinking. Gusts exceeding 40 miles per hour generated enough force to push the icy air through gaps that would pose minimal problems under calm conditions. The combined effect of extreme cold and high winds overwhelmed the thermal capacity of every standard cabin in the valley, creating life-threatening conditions inside structures that had previously provided adequate shelter. Jacob Whitfield's cabin, standing up against the same brutal conditions that were overwhelming his neighbors, maintained a comfortable interior temperature of 55 degrees with his usual twice-daily fire schedule. The dense sphagnum moss barrier, compressed but not compromised by the extreme cold, continued to trap warm air in countless microscopic pockets, while the flexible lime clay outer layer moved with the contracting logs without cracking or developing air leaks. Wind pressure that forced cold air through the rigid clay chinking of other cabins could not penetrate the adaptive seal created by Whitfield's double-layer system. The difference in thermal performance became a matter of life and death rather than mere comfort. While his neighbors burned through their remaining firewood supplies in desperate attempts to maintain above-freezing temperatures inside their homes, Whitfield's family continued their normal daily routines in shirt sleeves, comfortable in every room of their cabin. The children played on warm floors, while the adults worked at indoor tasks without the bulky winter clothing that had become survival gear in neighboring cabins. By March 5th, the crisis had reached its peak. Tom Braswell, facing the agonizing choice between leaving his family to search for emergency firewood in deadly conditions or watching them slowly freeze in their failing shelter, made a decision that would vindicate Jacob Whitfield's methods before the entire valley community. Loading his wife and children onto a sled, he struggled through knee-deep snow to reach the Englishman's cabin, where he found warmth, safety, and a reluctant acknowledgement that unconventional methods had proven superior to generations of mountain wisdom. Ezra McClure arrived 2 hours later, carrying his youngest grandchild, who had developed dangerous symptoms of cold exposure. The Wilson family followed that afternoon, their desperate situation forcing them to abandon their cabin entirely and seek refuge with the immigrant whose seemingly wasteful preparation had become their salvation. By evening, 12 people crowded into Whitfield's cabin, which maintained comfortable temperatures for the expanded population with only a modest increase in firing frequency. The social dynamics of the crisis stripped away the community's resistance to acknowledging Whitfield's success. Families who had mocked his elaborate preparation now depended on his superior building techniques for their survival, creating a dramatic reversal that validated innovation over tradition and immigrant knowledge over established mountain practices. The moment of truth had arrived, and the man they had once called a fool had become their refuge from the deadly cold that had defeated every other cabin in Cove Creek Valley. The arrival of spring in 1893 brought more than just relief from the brutal winter that had nearly claimed several families in Cove Creek Valley. As temperatures climbed above freezing and the last snow melted from north-facing slopes, the community was forced to confront the building methods that had failed so catastrophically when tested by the extreme conditions. Jacob Whitfield's cabin stood intact and undamaged, its innovative chinking system having protected not only his own family, but also the neighbors who had sought refuge during the March blizzard. Tom Braswell was the first to approach Whitfield about learning the double chinking technique. The proud mountain man, who had initially dismissed the Englishman's methods as wasteful foolishness, now faced repair bills that would consume most of his spring farming budget. His cabin's north wall required complete rechinking where the clay had cracked and fallen away, while gaps between other logs needed patching before the following winter. The failure of proven techniques had cost him nearly 7 cords of precious firewood and brought his family dangerously close to freezing. Whitfield received his neighbors' requests for instruction without smugness or reproach, understanding that mountain pride ran deep and that admitting error required considerable courage from men whose survival depended on their building skills. He began the teaching process by explaining the fundamental principles behind his success, starting with the cellular structure of properly selected sphagnum moss and its superior insulating properties compared to chopped straw or other organic fillers used in traditional clay chinking. The moss-gathering expedition drew 8 families from throughout the valley, including Ezra McClure, whose professional reputation had suffered during the winter's trials. Whitfield led them to the north-facing creek banks where the longest, most resilient moss grew in perpetual shade, demonstrating the selection criteria that ensured optimal thermal performance. The moss had to be harvested during specific conditions, dry weather following several days without rain to prevent mold, and ensure proper compression characteristics when mixed with animal hair. McClure, swallowing his professional pride, asked detailed questions about lime preparation and mixing ratios. The veteran builder had never worked with lime mortar, which required knowledge of chemical reactions and timing that frontier construction typically avoided. Whitfield explained the process of burning limestone chips in small kilns, slaking the resulting quicklime with precise water measurements, and achieving the 40/30/20/10 ratio that created flexible, self-sealing exterior barriers. The technical knowledge transfer went beyond simple instruction to encompass the reasoning behind each step. Whitfield explained how lime mortar remained flexible as temperatures changed, allowing the chinking to move with expanding and contracting logs rather than cracking under stress. He demonstrated the vapor permeability that prevented moisture buildup while maintaining air barriers, and showed how the two-layer system created thermal breaks that interrupted heat conduction through cabin walls. Sarah Wilson, whose family had nearly lost their youngest child to hypothermia, took careful notes as Whitfield described the importance of air pocket preservation in the moss layer. The dense organic material had to be compressed enough to create structural integrity without destroying the countless tiny spaces that trapped warm air. Too little compression resulted in settling and gap formation, while excessive pressure eliminated the thermal properties that made moss superior to solid clay filling. By the autumn of 1893, 8 families had adopted variations of Whitfield's double chinking method, adapting the technique to their individual circumstances and available materials. Tom Braswell spent 6 weeks rechinking his cabin using sphagnum moss gathered from Cove Creek, while the Wilson family incorporated sheepswool obtained through trade with families in neighboring valleys. McClure, whose professional reputation depended on successful innovation, experimented with different lime sources and mixing techniques until he achieved results comparable to Whitfield's original method. The retrofit process proved more challenging than new construction, requiring complete removal of the failed clay chinking and careful preparation of log surfaces before applying the moss barrier. Families discovered that chestnut logs damaged by repeated freeze-thaw cycles needed repair work to create smooth surfaces that would accept the new chinking system. The labor investment was substantial, typically 3 to 4 weeks per cabin, but the alternative was another winter of inadequate thermal performance and potential survival crisis. McClure's adoption of the technique marked a crucial turning point in community acceptance. As the Valley's most respected builder, his endorsement carried weight that overcame lingering skepticism about immigrant innovations. He began incorporating double chinking into new cabin construction, charging premium rates for the superior method while training a new generation of mountain builders in techniques that combined Old World knowledge with New World materials. Word of the Cove Creek Valley innovation spread through the interconnected network of mountain communities via traders, relatives, and seasonal workers who moved between settlements. The story of the English immigrant whose seemingly wasteful preparation had saved lives during the hard winter became part of regional folklore, carrying practical knowledge along with entertainment value. Families throughout the Tennessee mountains began requesting builders who understood the moss and lime technique. Documentation of the method's effectiveness came through the careful record-keeping of families who had implemented the system. Temperature measurements, firewood consumption data, and maintenance schedules provided quantitative proof that double chinking delivered 60% reductions in heating fuel requirements while maintaining interior temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer during extreme cold snaps. The technique lasted 8 to 10 years without major maintenance, compared to 3 to 4 years for standard clay chinking. The Tennessee Agricultural Extension Service included Whitfield's method in their 1895 report on improved building techniques for mountain regions, providing the first official recognition of the innovation's value. The documentation helped spread the technique beyond word-of-mouth transmission, reaching builders and settlers throughout the Appalachian region who faced similar challenges with log cabin construction in harsh mountain climates. Regional variations developed as builders adapted the core principles to local materials and conditions.